today's notes are in actually typo there, Unit 2, and this is going to be page 17. I know that's hard to see. Sorry, I'll change the color I'm writing in. Page 17, cell structure. So a lot of you were able to look at a cell and find things inside of the cell. And so we're going to start by just making sure that we have some history about, we're now able to take pictures. This is a picture using a microscope of a cell. You'll look at some of those later. But that didn't always happen. The very first person to observe cells was a man named Robert Hooke. So he first observed the cells. He observed cells from the bark or cork of a tree, and he gave them their name, cells. So we want to give him credit for looking at cells. But what he saw were actually dead cells at maturity. And so the very first person to see living cells was a man named Anton von Leeuwenhoek. And he first observed living cells by looking at scrapings from his cheek. And this is something that we'll do in the next class, where we'll take some scrapings of your cheek cells and look at them under a microscope. It's a kind of hard picture to see, and there's not as much detail as we would like, but there are a few things that we can see that every cell is going to have. So there are three main things to know about cells. First, all organisms are made of cells. Every living thing is made of cells. This is how we define what is living. And so organism just means living. Cells are the structural and functional units of organisms. Structural means built of, and functional means job. So cells are what organisms are built of, and cells do the work for organisms. So it's just like when we talked about respiration. Respiration is not just breathing. Respiration is happening in every cell to give every cell energy. And at the very end of this unit, we're going to talk about how all cells come from pre-existing cells. That we have to do what's called cell division in order to get more cells. And so we're going to talk about what types of things are made of cells, what the jobs are of cells, and where cells come from, and how do we get more. So today we're mainly focusing on the types of cells. If we take the big category cells, we divide them into first two groups, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And we actually want to know what these words mean. Kary means nucleus. Pro means before. Before nucleus. It doesn't have a nucleus. These are small, simple cells. We call them bacteria. They do not have a nucleus or any membrane-bound organelles. Organelles are small parts that have a job. So prokaryotic cells are examples like bacteria. When we look at the pictures, sometimes they look simple, sometimes they don't. This one looks pretty complex, but they don't have any really complex parts on the inside. They contain a single, let's add in the word circular chromosome. Here we can see the circular chromosome. And they have rings of DNA known as plasmids, and they can actually trade these with each other. So we want to know about prokaryotic cells is they're small, they're simple. They are bacteria, both archaebacteria and eubacteria, two different types. No nucleus, no complex parts. They're not complex, they're simple. They do have DNA, they do have a cell membrane, they do have cytoplasm, they do have ribosomes, but none of those other fancy parts like the mitochondria or the chloroplasts. So those are prokaryotic cells. Let's talk eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic. Kary, meaning nucleus, and eukaryotic cells, animals made of eukaryotic, fungi like mushrooms and yeast, and protists like even the amoeba. These are complex cells, so when I compare a eukaryotic to a prokaryotic, I see a lot more going on the inside. They do have a nucleus and these membrane-bound organelles, things like the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the lysosome. Prokaryotes have parts, they're just not as complex. So the last part that we want to talk about today are actually going to be the 4 parts that all of these cells have in common. So no matter what type of cell you are, what do we have in common? The first thing that we see is that all cells have a cell membrane. This is different from a cell wall. A cell membrane is actually flexible. And we're going to talk more about the cell membrane in the next section. But we already know that it's made of phospholipids. So next to there, if you'll just draw a little bit of the cell membrane, here are the phospholipids. There's actually 2 layers of phospholipids. They form the barrier to separate the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. The cell membrane is what makes it a cell. We have to have the cell membrane to make it a cell. And so sometimes we draw it as a circle. Sometimes if we're drawing an animal cell, it might be slightly more flexible, take on a slightly different shape. We'll talk about nerve cells that look like this. Very different shape. All cells have something on the inside, and that's called the cyto. Cyto actually means cell. Plasm, or filling, and it is mostly water. The third thing that all cells have is DNA, and we've already talked about what DNA is. It's a nucleic acid, but it contains directions to control the cell. Let's add in by making proteins. Here's your DNA double helix. It's in every cell, simple cell, complex cells, all cells have this double helix. And that double helix has the information to build proteins that do all the work. Remember the 6 jobs of proteins? Right? We've got proteins that are structure, like hair and nails. We've got proteins that are communication, antibodies, enzymes, pigments. And so what we need to focus on is that every cell has DNA. Well, if I want to have a protein, I've got to make it, and I make it at what's called the ribosome. And I think that out of the 2, we want to put a star by cell membrane and ribosome. These are the 2 we really want to focus on. This is the organelle that builds or synthesizes the proteins. And we actually already know what proteins are built of. They're built of, or from, amino acids. So no matter what type of cell you are, you have these 4 things. You might have more, but you always have these 4. So when we start talking about cells, we want to be aware of who first saw cells. We want to be aware of what are the properties of cells. We want to know the types of cells and what's inside of cells. And so that's actually all the notes that we're taking for now. What I'd like for you to do is write a summary. Stop and think. What did we just talk about? Well, we talked about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And so I want you to summarize that section of notes, making sure that in your summary you use those words and you underline them once you've used them.